Kitab al-Zakat. Now, after the things that we'll be discussing in Kitab al-Zakat, after understanding its status in Sharia, uh, it can revolve around five things. First is to know uh, on whom zakat is wajib. Second, to know the type of wealth and poverty in which zakat becomes wajib. The third is how much, what's the threshold for zakat to become an obligation, and how much are you supposed to give. And fourth is knowing the time, when it's wajib and when it's not. And the last thing to know is like, for whom is this zakat? Like, who's the recipient of zakat? And how much can you give those people, right? So these are the things that we need to discuss in Kitab al-Zakat. But first of all, we need to know what zakat itself is. So the word zakat, linguistically, it means growth, right? And it means purification. So zaka zar'u or zaka al-arz is when the crops or the earth grows, right? And also tazkiyah comes from the same word of zakat, because in tazkiyah, you're actually growing your spirituality, or you're growing your connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or you're growing in deeds of goodness and stuff like that. So the reason why this monetary compensation that a person gives out, its relationship with the word of zakat, is because when you give, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives more, gives you back, right? So one other word that's used for zakat and other types of sadaqat in the Quran is infaq fi sabilillah. The word infaq, it comes from the root word noon faqa nafaq. And nafaq, it's actually a tunnel. And so if you shut off one side of the tunnel and cars keep coming in, there'll be a point in time that they'll be jammed because the one that came in wasn't able to get out. So at a point in time, that whole nafaq, that tunnel will be clogged and no more cars can come in, right? So the same is for our wealth. So if we don't give zakat, if we're not spending it, there'll be a point in time where it's going to clog and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will stop giving us more, right? And so the more you give, the more it comes back. So in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, وَمَا أَنفَقْتُم مِّن شَيْءٍ فَهُوَ يُخْلِفُهُ, that whatever you spend in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He will substitute it for you. He will give you something in return, right? And the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned, مَا نَقَصَ مَالٌ مِّن صَدَقَةٍ, that giving sadaqah does not decrease your wealth, right? So think of it as energy. If it's stored in your body, it's going to ruin things, but it flows, right? Uh, it is beneficial. So the reason why zakat, being one of the infaqat, is known as zakat because number one, it purifies your wealth. And so in the hadith, it's mentioned that zakatul mal hiya awsaqul mal. That what you give in zakat is actually the dirt of your wealth. So you're removing that, right? So you're purifying it. And the other reason why is, like I mentioned, when you give out zakat, your wealth actually grows, sometimes in number and sometimes in the barakah. Right? So that's the connection of the linguistic meaning of zakat with the concept of zakat in Sharia. Now, obviously, we need to know what zakat actually is because, like I mentioned, infaq can be on many different levels, and zakat is a special form of that infaq. And so zakat shar'an can be defined as tamlikul mal bi ghayri ibaz, من فقير مسلم بشرط قطع المنفع عن المملك من كل وجه لله تعالى. That zakat is actually uh, giving ownership of some part of your wealth to a needy Muslim person without any compensation, right? And with the condition that you no longer will have any say or any control over that wealth. And all of this is for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, some people mention that not every faqir Muslim is entitled to zakat. He also, or they, she also should be ghair hashimi. They shouldn't be from the family of the Prophet alayhi salam. But there's a bit of a debate about this, and we'll talk about it a bit later on. But I'm not including it in the definition because of the fact that there is some difference in opinion. So this is the definition of zakat, and most of us are well aware of the legal status of zakat, that it is farz, right? So in about 82 places in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has joined together uh, salah and zakat. Aqimu salah wa atu zakah, right? And we know that salah is farz. And so joining zakat together is giving the indication of importance that this is also farz, right? And the Sunnah, we know that Bunya al-Islam ala khams, that Islam is based on 5 pillars. And one of them is Ita zakah, to give zakat, right? And then the Prophet Islam also mentioned خُذْ مِنْ أَغْنِيَائِهِمْ وَرُدَّ إِلَى فُقَرَائِهِمْ, that you're to take some of the wealth of the rich and give it to their poor, right? And if that wasn't enough, the importance of zakat and the fact that there's a consensus on that it's an obligation, right? You can understand it from the time of Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu. The Prophet of Islam just recently passed, and some of the tribes, Arab tribes, they refused to give zakat. And they said that we used to give it to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam because he was the Prophet of Allah. And now, since he's no longer with us, we're not going to give any other person the zakah of our wealth, right? And this was a time when there were apostate wars going on, different people who had claimed prophethood. So Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu had to send armies to fight them. Then there was one army set to go to Rome. And so Medina at that time was basically defenseless. There weren't a lot of Sahaba over there. And yet when these tribes refused to give zakat, Abu Bakr Siddiq was adamant that he's going to take it back. Even if what was just a single piece of rope that they used to give in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, he would take it from them, if by force necessary. And being defenseless, Umar radiallahu anhu was coming to him again and again that just for the time being, let them off the hook. And when your armies come back, then we can take that issue. Yeah. But the Khalifa to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was so adamant. He said that if I have to go alone to have this fariza enforced, I'm going to do it alone, right? Uh, and the words, they were so profound that he used, أَوَيُنْقَصُ الدِّينُ وَأَنَا حَيٌّ, that how could it be that the deen, that Islam, be reduced when I'm still alive? That differentiating between the status of salah and zakah, letting one be farz and the other being something optional, was out of the question. So I'm going to uphold everything in its place, which Allah and His Rasul have told us, even if I have to do it alone. And so, as a side note, this tells us the importance of keeping everything in Islam in its rightful status. Like we have to do our utmost, even if we're all alone, right? So it's not just zakat, it's like every aspect of our Sharia, every aspect of our Islam for us in it is a lesson that we have to try our level best, wherever we are, whoever we are, uh, in order to establish the principles of Islam to whatever extent that we can. Now, coming back to uh, the book, so we mentioned that zakat is an obligation. So Imam Quduri mentions الزكاة واجبة على الحر المسلم البالغ العاقل إذا ملك نصابا كاملا ملكا تاما وحال عليه الحول. So he mentions that zakat is wajib, and by wajib, what we mean over here is farz, right? Because as you know, the difference between farz and wajib is basically that of aqidah and not of amal. So a lot of times the fuqaha will use the word wajib and they refer to it as farz, right? Because of the adillah that I mentioned, it's mentioned in the Quran, the hadith, and there's the ijma of the entire ummah on that. On whom is it wajib? And then he mentions the conditions of zakat becoming wajib on a person. That person should be free, sane, an adult, Muslim, and they should have the nisab at least, and they should have complete ownership of that nisab, and one lunar year should pass over. So these are a total of 7 conditions that you could say are necessary to be met before zakat becomes wajib on a person. Free Muslim adult sane who has the minimum of a nisab and complete ownership of it, and a year should pass over it. So see, these 7 conditions must be met before it can happen. First of all, that person should be free, obviously, because slaves cannot have ownership. And so whatever they have belongs to their master. And because you can't own anything, if you can't own anything, then obviously you can't give zakat, number one. Number two, uh, you have to be a Muslim because zakat is an act of ibadah, and an ibadah from a non-Muslim uh, is not possible. The third is that person should be an adult because again, since this is an act of ibadah, you need taklif. You need to be a mukallaf. You need to be required by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And children are exempted from the Sharia, from a lot of the ahkam. And so you can't force him to do this act of ibadah. So there's no zakat on children, right? And that person should be sane because sanity is one of the components of taklif, of being mukallaf. And if that concept of taklif is not found in a person, such as an insane person, then they are not required to pay zakat. And you should have the minimum amount of nisab because zakat is you giving extra wealth, extra what you own to someone who's in need. But there needs to be like a threshold for that to judge whether or not you reach the level of affluence, whether you're no longer needy. And so the Sharia has set different standards for different types of wealth. So you need to at least meet that level. And last condition you have is another condition is a milk tam, that the nisab that you have, you should have complete ownership of it. Because if you don't have complete ownership, it's partially owned by someone else, or there are other hukuk and rights related to it, uh, which means you don't have complete control over it or complete ownership of it. And if that happens, then again, you can't give zakat because you might not be meeting other conditions because of this. And lastly, 1 year. And one lunar year is because a lot of different types of wealth that people can have, their growth uh, differentiates with the seasons. Like, so if you have land in which you grow crops, or maybe even specific trade items, their sales and their values fluctuate with the seasons. So if you deal in, for example, winter products, then the value of those products will rise in winter and will go down drastically in the summer, right? And so because of this, 1 year is given for an entire cycle to pass of all different seasons to actually make sure that this wealth has the ability to grow, right? And not every kind, as we'll study later on, not every kind of wealth uh, is subjected to zakat. It should have the ability to grow. So 1 year is given to actually be able to judge whether or not certain type of wealth has the ability to grow. And usually the 4 seasons are enough to make a sound judgment of that. So anyhow, these were the conditions for zakat becoming wajib and the reasoning behind them. Then he goes on to mention وَلَيْسَ عَلَى سَبِيٍ وَلَا مَجْنُونٍ وَلَا مُقَاتَبْ زَكَاتٌ. There's no zakah on a minor, an insane person, and a muqatab. The first two, they're not even mukallaf. And the third one, although mukallaf in some sense, but because he's a slave, he has no ownership of whatever he has. But I should mention one more thing is that it is Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala and the Hanafi madhab that considers zakat to be a form of ibadah. And that's why we say that a sabi and majnoon are exempted from that. Other Aimma, for example, Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala, they consider zakat as initially and primarily a gharama maliyah, basically kind of a wealth tax. And then secondary, it is an ibadah. So its primarily function is that of a zakat tax. And so that's why, according to those Aimma, they suggest that there is zakat in the wealth of a child and the wealth of a majnun, an insane person as well. Because taxes, they're not tied to taklif, right? They're not tied to you being uh, sound enough to do any ibadah. Just like if someone had like an agricultural land and they would have to give worship, regardless of their status, of their condition, because Ushur is basically, although it's called Zakatul Ars, the zakat of the land, but it's more of a land tax, right? And so whether it's owned by a child, everybody agrees that you have to give that Ushur. Whether an year passes or not, whatever your earth produces, you have to give Ushur. That's agreed upon and everything, right? But zakat, the one we're talking about, actually differs from those two. So the difference between the IMA should be kept in mind because a lot of companies may be taking this into account. Like if you hold shares of a certain company, right? And those companies sometimes what they might do is if it's an Islamically functioning company, it might give zakat on behalf of the shareholders. Uh, and it's the concept is tied with the that of the child. I won't go into detail, but if they, for example, give zakat on someone's shares, and for example, they're from the Hanafi madhab, it's very possible that they never had zakat on that, and so they might want to take that into calculation when giving zakat on other parts of their wealth, right? And so a lot of times these differences, especially if you're living in a society where the different mazahib interplay, you might find and feel these differences acting out. And so knowing why this is happening actually helps. We'll come. two more examples about how this can affect this difference of opinion can have effects later on, inshallah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right. So coming back, وَمَنْ كَانَ عَلَيْهِ دَيْنٌ يُحِيطُ بِمَالِهِ. If someone has a debt which encompasses his entire wealth, فَلَا زَكَاةَ عَلَيْهِ. That person no longer has to give any zakat, right? But according to Imam Shafi rahimahullah, zakat becomes wajib in that case as well, because even though he might be in debt, but if he still has enough wealth which reaches the nisab, he meets the condition of reaching the nisab. As for us, we argue that although he has nisab in his hand, but basically that's uh, tied to and involved with his needs, i.e., the need to repay his debts. So it's as if it doesn't exist, right? Because if he was to pay debt, or at least the possibility of the court ordering him to give that wealth in his debt payment, or someone just by force taking what they are owned back, he wouldn't be left with anything. Like, he wouldn't have the right to say, give that back, that's mine, right? Because that's not his. Uh, it's owned by someone else. And so because it's owned by someone else, even though you're not actually paying them, it's considered as non-existent in that sense, right? Both these mazahib are like on the extreme ends. So as for whatever kind of dain it is, whatever kind of debt it is, if it encompasses your entire wealth, there is no zakat. And for Imam Shafi, there is zakat, right? The main question that rises is about trade debts. So most of the businesses, like if you look at those businesses, those millionaires and those extremely wealthy people, they're always in debt, especially if in the capitalist context, they're always in debt. I mean, the richest people in the world, there would be no zakat on them, because most companies, they work on that credit system. And so they're always in debt, yet they're making millions, right? So if we go right with the Hanafi mazhab, like 100%, it actually forfeits the objective of zakat. So the objective of zakat is to tax the rich so they can help the poor. But if you look at it, how the capitalist society works, those who we consider the richest people would be actually poor and entitled to zakat, right? That really doesn't make sense and defeats the objective of the Sharia. And so that's why scholars today, they differentiate between personal debts and financial debts, i.e., or trade debts. And so those debts which a company is taking on, like for the purpose of tijara, for the purpose of trade and business, there's still zakat on it. But if it's like for your personal needs and then it encompasses your wealth, then there's no zakat on it. So as far as trade debts are concerned, the Hanafi fuqaha today take on the opinion of Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala. And as a side note, this again tells us about the beauty of the different madhahib. It's not very rigid, keeping the objectives of Sharia in mind and the needs of the people. There is leeway for you to actually take an opinion from a different madhab as well. Obviously, as individuals and as students or laymen, we can't cherry pick what to take from other mazahib. But for the fuqaha and for the people in the Dar Lifta, there's this way open to actually facilitate our lives according to the Sharia, need be to take masail from different madahib as well. خيرا, if your wealth encompasses your entire wealth, if it's a personal loan, then there's no zakat. وإن كان ماله أكثر من دينه, but if you have wealth more than your debt, right? So first you reduce and minus the debt, and whatever remains, زكى الفاضل إذا بلغ نصابا, if it reaches the nisab, that which is left after paying the debts, uh, then you give zakat on that. Because now you have wealth that reaches the nisab other than that of the debt. So you're, shut on speaking, rich, right? Now he's going to talk about the type of items in which there isn't zakat. وليس في دور السكنى وثياب البدن وأثاث المنزل ودواب الركوب وعبيد الخدمة وسلاح الاستعمال زكاة. So there is no zakat on residential houses, clothes for the body, household goods, riding animals or vehicles that you're using, slaves for personal use and not for trade, and weapons that are for personal use and not for trade. And also, for example, books for scholars and tools for people of that trade, right? So, for example, if you're into academia and education, your books are the kind of things that you need, and so there's no zakat on them. But for someone who's not into academia, maybe they're different trade purposes, or they're just collecting it to make up a personal library, not for the intention of reading it, right? Uh, then that could potentially be zakatable. But for those who need it, uh, for them, there's no zakat on it. Similarly, alatul muhtarifin, tools of a specific trade. For that tradesperson, there's no zakat in them. So the principle basically is anything need, which is your haja asliya, which is your actual need, and you need it on a day-to-day basis. There's no zakat on that, right? So you might own like 5 houses or across the globe, but you travel a lot, so you're actually living in each of those houses. There's no zakat on any of them, right? You might have like 1,000 set of clothes, but like you use all of them somehow. You change it every single day and you probably use all of that. Then there's no zakat on that either. So anything involved, you might have 3 cars at your home, you use all of them. No zakat on any of them, right? So anything which is in your use, like day-to-day use, weekly use, it's not just sitting there for like years on end. So there's no zakat on those things, right? No matter what they are. Another type of zakat on which there's no wealth is known as al-malu zimar. So malu zimar is actually, in short, lost wealth, a wealth to which you don't have access to. So for example, you gave someone some money and they owed you, but they now reject for years on end. They're rejecting and refusing to give you back on the basis that they didn't take anything from you. Like they don't own you, right? And you don't have any evidence for that either. So let's say you gave someone like $10,000 and it's been like 5, 6 years. And after 5, 6 years, they have this moment of realization and they make tawbah and then they claim that, yeah, I actually do owe you. You don't have to give zakat for the previous 5 years. From the year that that person has made tawbah and gives the money back to you, or you could access it through having tried him through court, maybe. That is the year you give zakat. For those previous 5 years in which you had no proof and he wasn't willing to give, he was rejecting the fact that he ever owed you anything. This is considered as lost wealth, the one which you have no access to. So there's no zakat on that. Similarly, if, for example, You're traveling on a cruise, maybe you drop something in the ocean, and maybe after 10 years you're on the beach and something like a chest maybe or your suitcase, it comes back to you and you see it, oh, that's my suitcase. And in it were like gold bricks, right? You don't have to pay zakat for all those 10 years because for those 10 years, you didn't have access to that wealth, right? Similarly, you buried something in an open ground, for example, then you forgot about it, like the location of where exactly that was. And maybe 20 years you come back and you suddenly realize that, oh, that's where I buried it under that palm tree. You go dig it up. And maybe again, it was a treasure chest filled with gold coins. For those 20 years, there's no zakat because that wealth was actually lost, right? So any kind of wealth that you lost access to it and it wasn't something that you could possibly do. For example, if you hide something in your home and forget it, like that's not lost wealth because it's not that difficult to search your entire home. So this type of wealth, mal zimar, which we call it, is also something in which there is no zakat, right? Also, another example of this is buying something with the intention of trade or without the intention of trade. So, for example, a person who buys a house, for example, for the purpose of personal use, or maybe they don't have any intention at all, right? There's no zakat on it. Because remember that intention enough in zakat, intention is not enough in zakat. It should be accompanied by action, right? So there are different forms of this. For example, if I buy something without the intention of zakat, there's no zakat on that, obviously. But but if I intend zakat after I have actually bought it, there's still no zakat for the simple reason that no action follows my intention. I initially bought it for my personal use, right? And now I'm deciding I no longer want it. I'd rather sell it. But because no action follows this new intention, there will no there will be no zakat on this property of mine until I actually sell it. And then whatever I receive, the cash that I receive, or if I barter it for something else, an entire year should pass over it, and then there will be zakat, right? Let's take the other way. I initially bought this property for the sake of trade, right? So that intention accompanied an amal, an action, which was me, first of all, intending to buy something for trade and then actually purchasing it. So the action of purchase now necessitates that this property, there should be zakat on it. Now imagine halfway through the year, I decide that no, I'm no longer selling it. I'd rather use it for personal reasons. Or maybe I don't have the intention of selling it right now. I might use it for something else. My intention becomes shaky. Now you no longer have to give zakat. You might be wondering, well, he just made the intention or she just made the intention of not using it, but it hasn't been accompanied by any action, right? That's a question someone can have, but the answer is it has been accompanied by an action, the action of not trading. So not doing something, abstaining from trade in itself, that abstinence is an action in itself. So whenever you make the intention that I'm no longer going to trade in it, that intention in itself actually is followed automatically by an element. And so the moment you make that intention, that's it. No more zakat on it. And let's say you again change your intention. Like you bought it for tijara, for trade, then you intended, no, I'll use it for my own benefit or maybe give it to charity. And then midway through, you again change your intention, saying, nah, I'd rather sell it. Now, this new intention is not followed by action. So there's no zakat on it until you actually sell the thing, get the cash, and then an year passes, and then you give zakat. Because again, when you made that second niyyah for tijara, it wasn't accompanied by an action of tijara. So hopefully this concept of niyyah and amal is clear through these examples. I'll give you one more example, or not example, a more elaboration that is that this intention amal process actually only happens with those kind of transactions which are by your own choice. Like if you own something by that which is not your choice, for example, irth, mirath, you're getting something in mirath, or you're getting something in wasiya, there's no zakat on just acquiring those things because that was not something you had any control over, right? So the intention of trading and then acquiring wealth only happens with things that you do by your own choice, something that's automatically coming to you without you having to do anything. A gift, for example, a wasiya, right? A khula or sulh, something like that. There is no zakat on that. All right, we deviated from the book a lot, but these were important masail that we need to be aware of. Coming back to the book, ولا يجوز أداء الزكاة إلا بنية مقارنة للأداء أو مقارنة لعزم مقدار الواجب. So payment of zakat is not valid without an associated intention to pay or associated intention for the disposal of the obligation of the amount, right? So because it's an ibadah, you need intention for that, that you're intending to actually give it out as zakat and not as some random piece of charity, right? But what this would require is that every time you're giving something as zakat, you make the intention of it. And this might be sometimes difficult to make a new intention every time. You may not be giving everything that you need to give in zakat at one point in time. You might separate it out. Okay? So each time, if you were supposed to make intention, this could pose some difficulties because we're not always aware of that. So what the fuqaha allow is that if you're like separating the amount of zakat, a lot of people do, they separate the money that they have to give in zakat, put it in a special envelope. So if you're doing something like that, and you're like taking, for example, $300 you have to give in zakat, you're taking them out, putting them in an envelope with the intention of zakat. So every time you give out from that envelope now, you don't have to make the intention of zakat anymore. So that initial intention of separating this wealth for zakat, that intention just plays on along every time you give from that envelope. But if you're giving it from some other source, then obviously you're going to have to make the intention of zakat because uh, you really don't know for what purpose it's being given, right? That container, that envelope, made it very clear that this is zakat mal, but any other source from which you're giving must be accompanied by the intention in order for it to count as zakat. Now, someone on whom zakat was obligatory, but what they did was they gave their entire wealth in charity, not with the intention of zakat, in other forms of sadaqah, optional charity, right? The question, the zakat was not wajib on this person, but he didn't pay, gave all of it in charity. Does he still have to pay zakat? Because that obligation still remains, does it not? Qiyasan, logically speaking, it does. Because if you didn't make the intention, everything you gave was normal sadaqah, it wasn't zakah, and the obligation of zakah still sticks with you. So you're going to have to give that. Well, this is what normal logic would say, but istihsanan will say that your zakat is also uh, yeah, it lapses, kind of like you've already paid your zakah, because the zakah that you were going to give was some part of your entire wealth, an undefined part of that, right? And since you gave your entire wealth in zakah, that undefined part is also gone. Oh, in sadaqah, that undefined part is has also been given away. And so because that was fixed for zakah, we'll just assume that your zakah has already been paid, right? But this only happens if someone gives sadaqah of everything that they own with the intention of zakah. But if you give only like some part, 70%, 80%, even 90%, you still have something left and you didn't make the intention of zakah, you're still going to have to give zakat. The reason why we're here is, as we mentioned, that zakat was an undefined portion of your entire wealth. Although you gave that 90% of your wealth in sadaqah, it is possible that it was that 10% that you have left, which was the portion of zakat. So your intention was necessary in this case in order to consider as zakat, but because you didn't have any, this will not be considered as zakat, right? So this was the first part of Kitab al-Zakat, talking about its farziyah, its obligation, its conditions, the kind of wealth or situations in which you're not supposed to give zakat. There was an important thing that I wanted to mention at the very beginning of the book, which I forgot, and was the reason why I always choose to separate Kitab al-Sawm and Kitab al-Zakah. So normally if you see it in the books of fiqh, they're usually joined together. It's usually Kitab al-Zakah followed by Kitab al-Sawm, right? Uh, and one of the ways that I go about it is when Ramadan comes around, I teach Kitab al-Sawm because those masail are really relevant at that time. And like when Udhiyah is around, I tend to teach Kitabul Udhiyah because those masail are relevant. So it's really good to know the relevant masail because sometimes, you know, an year passes before these things happen, so you might forget. But I deliberately differentiate, I separate zakah and saum because for most of us, you might assume a lot of people, they wait to take out their zakah in Ramadan. And their intention is really poor. It's really good. They want that extra ajr, the 70 times more ajr that you get when you're giving out zakah in Ramadan, right? The reason why I take zakah really out of the way of Ramadan is because a lot of the times, in light of that extra ajr, we sometimes seem to defeat the higher purpose of zakah, right? So if you see how that whole system is modeled, it's like there's no fixed time period for each and every single person where zakat becomes wajib. It's actually in a state of fluctuation. Whenever you reach nisab and the entire year passes, for one person this could be in Muharram, for the other it could be in Safar, for someone it could be in Ramadan, for the next it could be in Dhul Hijjah. It could be like year round. With so many people, it's probably possible that each person becomes sahibul nisab like in every month of the year, right? So the entire cycle of the year is where people are becoming sahibun nisab, then giving zakat. It's also very possible that your own nisab might shift. 1 year could be Muharram, and maybe the next time it might end up in Rabiul Awwal. That possibility exists, right? And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has designed zakat and its ahkam in a way that it's happening all year round, because the purpose of zakah is basically helping those in need. And people don't only get needy in Ramadan, they might be needy, they might require that assistance, and they do require that assistance all year round. It can happen in any month, right? And so, keeping that extra ajr in mind, what people tend to do is hold back until it's Ramadan and then give it in Ramadan. And so, what happens in Ramadan, there's a lot of charity going on, and those people who need that assistance, they can get a month by, a month two by, but then the rest of the months, the level or the intensity of assistance drops down. And that's when they're going to face difficulty going about their day-to-day lives, right? Uh, and that's not what the Sharia wants. The Sharia wants that there be a system in place and everybody be willing to help the other in need, whatever year, whatever time of the year it is, right? So the purpose of actually taking zakat away from Saum is to actually make us realize of what zakah is actually about, right? And remember, the one who's giving 70 times ajr in Ramadan knows your intention outside of Ramadan as well. There's nothing stopping him from giving you 70 times, 100 times, even 1,000 times more ajr, right? So again, one of the reasons why we study fiqh is to understand like what is actually required from us at any point in time. So yes, Ramadan gets you more ajr as a general rule, but maybe helping someone out right now in Safar or in Rabiul Awwal, it might hold 1,000 times more virtue than you waiting until you give it in Ramadan, right? So your intention at the time of helping someone out in need, that might trump the ajr of Ramadan. Again, I'm not belittling the barakah of Ramadan or anything, but we need to understand what zakat actually is and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually wanted to design it uh, in order for society to be able to help out their needy, to help out their poor all year round. And so I want you to keep this in mind. And when you're talking about zakat, and the next time, whenever you come to think of, oh, maybe I'll wait for Ramadan before I give zakat, just keep in mind that, you might find someone who needs it now, and it'd be better to assist them now than to actually wait. Even if it's like there's only a week difference between now and Ramadan, you might want to take into consideration that person rather than the promised 70 times more virtue. Because again, niyatul mu'min khayrun min amali. The intention and motivation of a believer trumps his amal, trumps his actions, right? And so this was a special note that I kind of wanted to talk about, uh, zakah. Hopefully that